For years he's generated media scrums. This weekend he's been generating headlines while trying to stay away from the cameras, throwing a grenade into the debate on Brexit, as one aide put it, with grabby language that looked designed to throw attention away from his private life. He was cornered by cameras at his Oxfordshire home today. As Boris Johnson wrestled for a parking space, another minister who resigned over Theresa May's plans for Brexit warned that an 80-strong group of pro-Brexit Tory MPs was ready to vote down the deal if Mrs May presses ahead.
I'm gravely concerned that our party is heading towards a really catastrophic split if this plan is taken forwards, and particularly if it's taken forwards and driven through with Labour votes.
Steve Baker's been involved in enough rebellions over the years to know that you never know what the numbers are, literally often to the last hour, let alone the last day, and that's when you know what the proposal is.
How are you?
However many Tory rebels there were, the Chief Whip, Julian Smith, would have to win over nearly the same number of Labour MPs to plug the gap.
I think we're going to have another positive week and a positive conference, and we're going to deliver Brexit.
Pro-Brexit Tory MPs think the Chief Whip hopes fear of no deal and chaos and closeness to the March deadline for Brexit will grind down Tory opponents.
If the government were to seek to terrify people into voting for anything rather than no deal, I do think that that would be profoundly against the national interest.
So that's where you think they're heading?
Well, I fear that the government may seek to terrify people. It ought not.
Actually, Steve, come on, be a statesman here. Don't be a cheap, backbench troublemaker. Be a statesman here. Put the nation's interests absolutely first and foremost, and that does not involve putting Brexit at risk.
Boris Johnson was caught by the cameras watching the Test match of the weekend. His face on the big screen prompted some boos from the crowd.
The former Foreign Secretary appears to be on his own.
There was also a bit of a diplomatic boo from the EU's chief negotiator today.
Let me say that I have a great respect for Mrs May. Great respect. And generally speaking, I have a great respect for the British people, for this country.
Including Boris Johnson.
For this country.
Michel Barnier said it was realistic to imagine a deal being agreed within 6 to 8 weeks. That sent the pound up. But Theresa May's pro-Brexit Tory critics say she has 6 to 8 weeks to change policy.
People might make a move on her if she hasn't changed tack by November.
I wouldn't like to forecast that. What I am saying is that political chaos lies ahead if we don't get
what you're saying.
I'm not threatening it. What I'm saying is I am deeply concerned from my canvassing of colleagues that what lies ahead is chaos if there isn't a change of policy.
If Theresa May pursues Chequers, the Tory party could split in two. Well, listening to you, listening to him, sounds like that's work in progress.
Is it only two?
The government today published the Boundary Commission review of general election constituencies. It's meant to bring down the number of seats by 50, but also even up the size of different constituencies. Experts say if these had been the constituencies fought in the last general election, Theresa May could be governing with a majority of 16. As it is, she's trying to govern without a majority and can't be sure she'll get these changes through or her Brexit plans. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, more from him later in the programme. Earlier, I spoke to the Conservative MP, Ross Thompson. He's a backer of Brexit. I asked him why we haven't seen any sign of a document supposedly to be released today that would outline some alternative plan.
Well, what you'll be seeing over the next few weeks is actually the ERG coming forward with proposals to actually give solutions to some of the problems that have been identified with Chequers. It's not an alternative plan. I don't think it should be one plan pitched against the other. That would be very unhelpful. Also, we're not the government, of course. We don't have the resources of a civil service. We are just a group of parliamentarians within Parliament. But you will see over the next few weeks real solutions, we believe, and helpful and constructive solutions to areas such as how we could mitigate some of the concerns around about the Northern Ireland border in order to have that kind of free, fair trade agreement that we would like to see. So some helpful solutions will be coming their way, just not the sort of comprehensive, detailed document that some people have talked about.
But therefore, the only plan we do have is the Chequers plan. What's wrong with that?
Well, in terms of the Chequers plan, John, I've been really clear that I don't think it meets what people voted for in 2016. I also would like to point out that...
Specifically how? Specifically?
Okay. Well, I'd like to point out, first of all, I did give the plan a chance. I wanted to get more detail and see the white paper before I made a decision on whether or not I thought it was the right thing to proceed with. I've come to the conclusion it's not, and the reasons for that, first and foremost, is I don't think it actually allows us to take back control of our own rule-making. You'll have heard of the Common Rule Book. That means we'll be tied into EU standards on goods and therefore the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. So in that sense, we are not leaving those institutions of the EU still bound into the rules that they have made and will continue to make in those areas.
But the fact remains that that is the only proposal that exists for ordinary voters to look at. And it seems that you were going to produce a document that people could look at, but now you're going to do it over a number of weeks and this and that. Why can't you be pithy and be as absolute as Mrs May has been?
Okay, I'd say it's not the only proposal. As you'll know yourself, and it has been something mooted by the European Union, is actually having that sort of super Canada-style free trade agreement. That's something I think would unite everybody.
Let's be clear. Mrs May is wedded to this plan, to the Chequers plan. If you get rid of the plan, you presumably have to get rid of her.
No, I've been really clear that Theresa May is our Prime Minister, our leader, and I still feel is the best person who's best placed to deliver on Brexit. I'm not interested in talking about personnel or changes in people. I just want to see the policy change.
But it's very clear that she is never going to embrace the Rees-Mogg spectacle of Brexit.
Well, I think the Prime Minister is someone who listens to her colleagues, and she's been doing that throughout the summer. I think she's also been listening to the public and Conservative Party members. I think they've been very, very clear that something does need to change. And the Prime Minister showed in the past that she can change her mind. Governments of all colours can show
the fact
they can
is,
change their mind.
She hasn't changed her mind and shows no sign of changing her mind. And there are at least 80 MPs, like you, Tory MPs, who are wedded to ensuring that Chequers doesn't happen.
Well, to be fair to the Prime Minister, she's been going round European capitals. I think she's been getting a message back from the EU itself that Chequers, as it is not going to work. I think she's been listening to colleagues over the summer who are telling her that Chequers is not going to work. I think that, yes, the Prime Minister can be, as it's called, the bloody difficult woman, but in fairness to her, I think she wants this to succeed and get through Parliament, and I think there will be changes to Chequers.
And is your Conservative Party leader in Scotland with you?
Ruth Davidson, I'm in close contact with. She is my leader in Scotland. We have taken different views on Brexit, but my loyalties are absolutely to her. And, down here I've got a job to do as an MP in terms of scrutinising the government as well as supporting it. And that's why we'd like to see changes to the Chequers plan.
Well, you sound to me as if you have a tangled political life. Two women leaders who you disagree with but are totally loyal to. And,
yeah, they're very strong women. We're very blessed in the Conservative Party to have such strong women.
Thank you very much indeed, Ross Thompson.
Thank you.
Well, now we're joined by the MP Sarah Wollaston, who backed Remain during the referendum campaign. Sarah Wollaston, this is becoming really quite worrying. 200 days to go. One plan which is rejected by 80 Conservative MPs and no alternative.
Yes, it's absolutely disgraceful. The hard Brexiteers haven't even come up with a credible, coherent plan of their own, despite having all this time to do so. And what we're now seeing is that them forcing us closer and closer to the edge of a cliff because the government has their plan. They are threatening to completely scupper it and will vote with Labour to do so. And meanwhile, the clock ticks down. 200 days now until we leave, and we could end up leaving with a chaotic no deal and no transition, which would be the worst possible arrangement of all.
Well, we must presume that Mrs May is actually working on something associated with Chequers, but that is in some way more palatable to the more difficult people in your party.
Well, the trouble with that, of course, is it is likely to be rejected by the European Union. So I come back to my former point that we have all these different groups speaking entirely different languages as the clock ticks down to the date that we're actually due to leave. And we could end up by accident almost. We seem to be sleepwalking to the edge of a cliff here. And I think that what we're seeing as well is as the government publishes their series of technical notes about planning for no deal, what the public are now seeing is the sort of disastrous financial consequences that will hold for us. So far from having any kind of Brexit bonus, we're going to see a very significant Brexit penalty and real consequences for individuals, families, communities and businesses that will become more apparent as I say, the clock ticks down to this situation. I think it's totally unacceptable.
technically, there is a majority of, well, shall we call them soft Brexit or even possible Remainers in the House of Commons. Do you talk to Labour Remainers, or at least to Labour soft Brexiteers, and perhaps see some way of forging a way forward?
Well, of course, and I think it would have been better if right from the outset we'd taken a cross-party approach to these negotiations, because the truth is that there are divisions within both main parties about the best way forward here. And I think that the discussions I have now across political parties is what happens if we are in a situation where we could crash out with a chaotic no deal. My view is, rather as we would expect anyone undergoing surgery to be able to give their informed consent, to know exactly what the operation involves, to be able to weigh up the risks and the benefits. And I think we would need to check informed consent from people before we embarked on something with such far-reaching consequences for them as a chaotic no deal with no transition.
You've just heard quite a typical current view from the Brexiteers, which is, I love Mrs May, but I hate Chequers. That surely doesn't stack up, does it?
It doesn't stack up.
Isn't the truth that they're really muscling to get rid of her and possibly get Boris Johnson in?
Well, and of course we've seen the very intemperate, inappropriate language used by Boris Johnson over the weekend, comparing our Prime Minister with a suicide bomber. I mean, how terrible was that? And these are the people who claim that they're loyalists, whilst at the same time using this kind of language and clearly trying to force her hand or threatening to remove her. It's wholly unacceptable. They need to be being prepared to sort of compromise and actually have a deal that actually can get through the House of Commons.
You're a doctor. You came into the House of Commons presumably as something of an innocent in a way. What has confronted you surely must have absolutely poleaxed your desire to be an MP.
Well, I think what has appalled me is the lack of an evidence-based approach to this. And as I say, I would use the medical analogy of informed consent, that you wouldn't expect as a patient to consent to surgery 2 years in advance without knowing whether someone was going to remove a few toes or your whole leg. And you certainly would expect at any point during that process, once you knew exactly what was involved, to have someone set out the risks and benefits and to be able to give your informed consent. And we certainly do not have informed consent to the hardest of Brexits with no transition because of the sheer scale of the costs and the consequences to real people's lives. And I think that if we do find ourselves falling off the cliff in that way, inevitably, in a few years' time, people will be asking how on earth it could have happened. And I think those MPs who haven't been very clear and straightforward with people about the consequences will be held culpable.
Dr. Sarah Williston, thank you very much for talking to us.